Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to talk about Stay Tuned. Ultimately, you can actually watch this movie fairly easily. Currently, at the second it's recording, you can watch it on free through YouTube. Also, you could also watch it on Tubi, which is a free movie and TV app service you can watch. Uh, those are two easy ways you can say that you saw this movie. I'd ultimately reviewed American Gods as well today, and I was like, oh my god, I completely forgot to mention that that show is a Stars show, or is on the app Stars right now, and just forgot to mention it. Stupid me. Anyways, so it's mistake. It can happen. So going into this movie, we have John Ritter, who ultimately plays Roy Nabel, who is just consistently like enamored with TV. Recently, once he's had a very long day of work, he comes home, sits in front of the telly, and just like watches a basketball game or watches just something like knowing every single thing all like seemingly word for word. We also have a salesman that is roaming around Roy's neighborhood, whose name's Spike, who is making TV deals that no one can turn down. Basically, Spike is going on to every single one of these neighbors and like offering them like, well, this great satellite and this great TV, and ultimately, yeah, like we have a free trial, and like they're like, what? Ultimately, when going into this movie, I had bumped into an actor while watching this film that I'm like, oh my god, Eric King in this movie. I know him from Dexter, and that is probably like my still to this day favorite show. And he plays Pierce in this movie. I'm like, oh my god, like bumping sounds like a weird word, but like I noticed him in this movie, and I was like, oh my god, like he was in Dexter. Like I don't think I ever tied the two, but if I probably did, then good on me, I guess. But yeah, I saw him and I was like, oh my god, yeah, he's on Dexter. Anyway, so moving on, we we're going into here and we have Roy who's watching TV, and Helen, who is his wife, is just like, you know what? Hey, the kids are away. The mice shall play. You know what I mean? Or the mice, whichever they are later on in this. And yeah, really, eventually it gets to the point where Roy is just like overtimes and like, yeah, we got to get the ball, and Helen is just like, dude, I'm gonna give you everything. I'm gonna give you all of this, and you're just like double overtime. I'm gonna make you. I want to make you stop and just look at all of this. Which ultimately, when the main part of this gets going, then eventually Roy does see Helen, does go, you know what, Helen, you're actually like, you know what, you're looking really great. You're looking really great, Helen. So we the part of this movie that is the most interesting is that these two people, because I'm gonna tee up this movie for some people. These two people, Helen and Roy, end up getting sucked into this TV. and have to live within this demonic TV for seemingly 24 hours. And they are consistently going from channel to channel to channel, hoping that they're going to see the static in some part of any channel to ultimately dip out of the next channel to be saved. So going into this movie, transitional words. We have like wrestling going on to this film. We have like a music video going on to this film because they make like a parody of MTV. They parody Star Trek. Star Trek: The Next Generation. They parody like Driving Miss Daisy, Wayne's World, everything. Like probably a bulk of whatever things were going on via that time. But there is like a ton of just references to just a bunch of overall just tons and tons of shows. I think reasonably when you get the credits roll, or there is also some like parodies of other shows where they go into furtherly like parody every single TV show that probably came out around that time. Like Murdered with Children or something like that. Like all parodies, all to make it so every single channel that these people go into, they are going to die. Funny enough, the game show that is ultimately showcased first in this is called You Can't Win. And so, yeah. Funny enough, we have. Yeah. All right, so I was looking at IMDb for some characters. I think the wrestlers, I'm probably not gonna remember who they are at first. I think they're both called Mr. and Mrs. Gorgon. Probably wrong. So yeah, this movie is really fun. It has a wide variety, and ultimately, it kind of like bottlenecks like a thing in time to ultimately you could see like what TV was like during a certain period, which I honestly think is really fun and cool. So let's go into the spoiler variation of Stay Tuned, because I kind of like gave you a walk in like thing, and so now let's really walk in and tell you everything that's going to go on past this point because I thought it was kind of fun. So going to that double five to ultimately verify that we are going into spoiler time, about the time into spoil this movie. So we, in as I teed up people letting you know about this, we ultimately have Daryl, who is also a Nabel that is narrating, but also like letting you know that like, hey, I'm going to mess with this TV, because in the very beginning of this, we have Daryl seemingly cutting into TV connections to this entire neighborhood and mentioning some crappy things about his sister on the TV, and his parents all well know about it, and they're just like, God, Daryl, you just yeah. But we're gonna come back into that later, and it's gonna be interesting. So let's tee up to the point of okay. Roy ends up making a deal with Spike to get this free trial, this TV, this huge satellite, setting it all up. We have Roy eventually watching some telly, and we eventually, because Helen eventually gets to the escalation point of like, dude, everything you're gonna get, you're gonna all of this. You want some of this? And Roy is just like, but double overtime, baby. Like, give me a couple of minutes, and then like just like, and she breaks the TV. She breaks the TV, and so he buys a smaller one. But then Spike comes in, gives him all this free trial, so he can watch TV, like all this TV again. But the thing is, and like during this time, like the offer is a 44-inch TV, and of course it's like a tube TV. I know because like I used to like sell TVs, and there'd be like LCDs and plasmas, and before that there was like tube TVs and all that business, all that jazz. So recently, like he has a tube TV. I'm like, yeah, bring him back. There was a lot of times eventually they had to like destroy just a bunch of tube TVs because they just couldn't sell them. Like they tried to like market down the price as much as they could, but they couldn't. Like there was just some big, huge, gigantic tube TVs that they couldn't do anything with because it was just like no one's gonna buy this giant tube TV now that like LCDs and plasma TVs are coming in, and they're thinner and like it's extremely hard. So we have it to where Roy is watching this TV, and he thinks that he can like as per usual like know everything that's going on in the show, but he's honestly wrong. He's just like, oh well, like I thought that this looked familiar, but like actually this isn't familiar at all. Because there is this like candid camera like moment where a cop comes to this woman's house to tell this wife that her husband is dead. She's like, "Oh my god, my husband is dead," and then ultimately the cop says, "Like, yeah, I'm sorry, ma'am, he is dead, but hey, could you look over there for a second? Like, can you see that camera that's over there?" And the woman's like, "Yeah, I can see a camera that's over there. Yeah, you're on you're on this candid camera show that ultimately we're gonna tell you that like someone is dead but they're not." And she's like, "Oh my god, oh my god, how could you, like, this is amazing that I'm on this show." And it's like, what? And it's like, so Roy is godsmacked about this, and he's like, what's going on, what's going on with this TV? So eventually it gets to the point to where we find out that Spike has this plan of he had contracted Roy. Um, Ultimately, when he made a contract with Roy, he kind of like, hey man, some people would sell their soul for this TV deal. And so recently, when we have Spike and Pierce and even Crawley eventually all going into seemingly um, this TV like wing, and they are now like going like, yeah, we got these people. Ultimately, Spike had also made deals with this two other couple, and ultimately one of the couple ends up getting like killed by seemingly some Godzilla character, which I thought was like, whoa, this is fun. But ultimately, like that is one of Roy's neighbors, and eventually we'll come back to that. So, but basically, like we consistently have Spike who's making deals with all these people to the point of like instead of he only had a contract for one person, but he brings in two because he just thinks that he's just that good, and every single one of them will all fall eventually to his demise, to otherwise killing every single one of them. So ultimately, these people have to last 24 hours into this TV, or they will get ushered into, uh, ushered into being either saved or just ultimately like realizing how good they actually are, and they'll live the rest of their life fun and free and whatever. So, which ultimately may or may not be Roy at this point or Helen. So we have it to where eventually Roy and Helen get sucked into this TV, and we have Daryl and his sister eventually just going like, "Hey, where's our parents?" Eventually, Daryl turns on the TV to find out, "Oh my god, like our parents are in the TV. This is crazy." Because ultimately, Daryl finds out later when Roy's in this like noir like scene. It's like, "Oh my god, is that Dad?" And then, "Oh my god," and then his sister notices that like his mom is on the newspaper in the noir show, because and then Daryl makes the conclusion of like, "Oh my god, they're in the TV." So first off, we have a there is a I believe a like there's gonna be some jumbling going on here. At first, we have Helen and Roy on a game show called You Can't Win. Ultimately, we have them being a contestant on a game show. They ultimately get seemingly cuffed to chairs, and ultimately the question is hey, like who are like people that you know that like are no longer in a relationship anymore. And ultimately Helen like has the perfect answer of like both of us are no longer in a relationship anymore because like we're just too disconnected. And like game shows like correct. And so they are ultimately set free to go into the next channel. The next channel is wrestling. Ultimately they are fighting, ooh, the Gorgons. Yeah, the Gorgons. I was like I gotta know this name because I think I just said it at some point earlier. So Roy and Helen are fighting the Gorgons, wrestling, fighting it out. Ultimately, Roy mentions that wrestling's fake. He gets freaking hit in the back. It's like ah. The Gorgons are decking, seemingly decking Roy and Helen. They have to fight this out. Ultimately, again, they get to the point to where they can win this match, and ultimately they get consistently keep like being thrusted into other channels. So we eventually have it at some point where they become any number of characters. They get into like a Tom and Jerry like scenario, which ultimately is evidently, from what I've heard, there's going to be a new Tom and Jerry movie coming out soon. Ultimately, I've heard that like Stay Tuned might be an AMC project that's eventually going to be pushed out at some point. Because so maybe this review is a good thing that I'm talking about it. But Roy and Helen are put into a Tom and Jerry like scenario where they're being chased by some robotic cat, which I thought was really fun. Eventually, they get the drop on the robotic cat, eventually taking them to the next scene, because ultimately they had to like unscrew their mouse hole to ultimately go into the next channel. So the more and more we go into this, so we ultimately have them consistently going through these channels. Eventually, Spike, the more and more Crowley like starts to consistently give him crap. If ultimately you don't know who Crowley is, he's the guy that ultimately starts losing limbs and stuff like that in this movie, which ultimately will find him connecting with the Nables in the winter Arctic episode or channel, where like you have this one like a science or doctor guy that is stuck in this cabin and he's losing fingers and everything like that. So we have it to where they eventually go into this noir scene. Eventually, Roy has to rescue his wife. Gangsters pop up to shoot him up. It's like a very noir like show where we have gangsters and black and white, and it's awesome. We have one of his neighbors who is mentioning it's like, hey, my wife died like X amount of channels ago, and luckily for me, I took my remote with me. So if any channel ever gets hot, I can just bounce into another channel. It's great. So eventually, the neighbor that Roy knows dies, and Roy and Helen go for the remote. Getting the remote, and then eventually, like, the remote consistently gets broken every single time they go somewhere. We ultimately have spin-offs of like Wayne's World, where ultimately Roy is tied to a chair and ultimately keeps getting smacked with a with a camera going way too close to his face, where he gets freaking hit and knocked back. Eventually, having a hot poker being placed on this camera, and eventually, like Roy like kicks the camera to untie him, and I guess Helen was ultimately in some seemingly magazine which the Wayne's World characters had. They were like zombie Wayne's World characters, which I thought was interesting. So Roy makes it out of there, and like there's consistent things going on here. So we eventually have this channel at some point when Roy and Helen meet Crowley, and they're in this like Arctic scene, and Crowley is getting eaten alive by dogs, and ultimately Roy and Helen figure out how to get out of this channel. They eventually end up in at some point through all of this. They end up in this like French time period era, and ultimately the French are going to go and and grab Roy's character and eventually cut off his head. So while that is going on, we have Daryl that is going to try to stop all this from happening, and so eventually he like gets a microphone to connect to the TV like signal. So while his father's head is getting chopped off, Daryl's like, "Yeah, I'm here, the voice of God," and like everybody's like, "What's going on?" Hilarious. So Roy gets released, and so basically, like Crowley is there in this French time period because luckily he was able, like he lost a couple limbs, but he's still kicking. And he's like, "Oh my god, like you beat the 24 hours that you were in this TV for. You've done it. You've beat it." And Spike is just a sore loser at this point, so he makes it so that he'll get Roy in the end. So Roy ends up winning and ends up being shot out of this TV, but they only shoot out Roy. They keep Helen. Ultimately, Spike ultimately kidnaps Helen to be in this Wild West scenario where she is tied up like those very old cartoons where you'd have some woman tied up via the railroad for like the Lone Ranger or somebody to come in and rescue them. So like the real Lone Ranger, really old, not old, just stuff that was probably in the back of people's minds a certain period ago. So we have here that Roy is being put out, and Spike is trying to drag him back in. So Roy ultimately is just like, well, I gotta go back for. I gotta, like, he's talking to his kids and he's like, I gotta go back for your mom. Like, I love her, and, like, I just didn't treat her right, and it took me, like, being in this TV to realize, like, how amazing and beautiful she is, and how, like, he overly compliments her, and he's like, you know what, like, I'm going to fight for her. Like, I'm going to save her because, like I want to be her hero, which is great. This is an amazing part of this movie that I really love. So we have Roy eventually going back into the channel and consistently surfing, fumbling over his remote. At some points in time, Spike is mentioning to him that he is going to be he's basically showcasing that he's going to be everyone in this scenario, which I thought was cool. We have uh, Roy playing hockey, where basically all of his opponents are Spike. We have him in Star Trek Next Generation, where he's Patrick Stewart's character, Jean-Luc Picard, and basically he's with a bunch of like seemingly Next Generation like people, but they all look very much like Spike at some point. Basically, the villain that Roy is fighting on the viewing screen is Spike, ultimately mentioning like, "Hey, wherever your TV go or wherever your remote is gonna go, so will I." So we keep going through and through all these channels, eventually to this HTV instead of MTV, because everything is either related to hell, everything is also like related to these like killing somebody or murder. Like Driving Miss Daisy was like, oh my god, we have this guy that's running over an old lady, and John Ritter's like, watch out, woman. Woman hits with the car, and like Spike is consistently repetitiously running her over. I'm like, oh my god. Spike like pulls his head out of the car and is like, I'm coming for you next, buddy. So yeah, eventually this all leads to the fumbling of the remote, and like the HTV or the MTV is where this all really lands. Because ultimately because Spike and Roy, before all this, before at one point when Roy comes back, they have a cowboy-esque like shootout, um, which ultimately like the bullet goes into, I think, one of the remotes at some point. It could have happened later. It could have happened. I think it happens later because like we have to like showcase how. Or no, no. Yeah, I think it ends up like more and more the remote ends up getting wrecked, but like they can still use it, I think, at some point. So I could be wrong about that. I probably am. So because he keeps using it at some point when they do the salt and pepper video, which I thought was like, yeah, this is cool. We have Roy dressing up as Prince, which I thought was interesting, and ultimately like we have the remote that is consistently beep booping to the music, which I thought was cool. So we have the remote eventually falling into the hands of Roy, and basically he ends up killing via pressing of the remote to Spike to kill him off. eventually Roy, because what happens is, ooh, there's a whole fencing match too. So Roy gets the remote, but here's what happens. So Roy gets the remote, but when they switch to channels, he breaks the remote. There we go. I'm like, oh my god, what happens to the disposal of the remote? Like, there's seemingly a ton of remotes that bizarrely get broken through all this, because like, oh, that's what happens. He ends up. There's a tussle between Spike's remote. So ultimately, Roy's remote gets broken, and then Roy goes after Spike's remote, and then they are both like battling over that, and then uh, like Roy gets Spike's remote, but the only problem is the next channel. Ultimately, Spike's remote also gets broken, and or seemingly broken, and so recently we have it to where Roy and Spike have to fence this out, and Roy knows that he is going to get the better of seemingly Spike. The only problem is Roy doesn't have a sword. Daryl eventually shoots out the sword via the satellite, and so Roy, bizarrely, like out of nowhere, like Thor's hammer, just grabs this thing and then starts fencing. And Roy is mentioning how like in depth that he knows about fencing, because we saw earlier him like kind of doing some fencing moves, and we know he had like dual swords on his wall, but like we barely quite knew why. But now we know. So Roy is going to outfence Spike, and then eventually we get it to where Roy is going to have another remote come out of somewhere and take down Spike and kill him off. Uh, Ritter or Roy ends up getting a remote, runs to his wife that is in the Western Channel, and ends up turning off the TV, to where both him and his wife vanish. They're back home, and like funny enough, when Roy came back from the TV initially, he told his like kids like, "Hey, I'm gonna be hungry, so keep those donuts raring to go." So eventually, I'm assuming once they got back home, he's like yeah, let's eat those donuts. Funny enough, I completely skipped around about the whole like Three's Company bit, where ultimately Roy is like going into this next channel. He like flips over the sofa, and then you have the two girls from Three's Company coming in, and he's like, ah! There's like a bunch of screaming that Ritter or Roy had to do in this movie, and so I was wondering like man, like was there just a ton, and I mean probably a ton of time where John Ritter had to go through this movie and just go back and just yell. Like I bet he probably just shredded his voice probably doing this movie, because how many numerous times through every scenario he had to just bah, just a lot in this movie, just blah blah blah. Like you would have thought that like at the end of this movie, this guy would have like, my voice is dead. Like I cannot shout anymore. But yeah, just blah blah blah. Blah. It's hilarious. So Roy and Helen are back home. Everything is all good, and reasonably, Pierce is now the new Spike, which I thought was like, yeah. And ultimately, he has like the remote that like shuts, like, uh, like, like slips back into his sleeve, Which I'm like, man, that is the most like awesome thing about this entire film is those numerous times where they would have these like remotes like shooting out of somebody's sleeve and then shooting back in. Like I just thought that was like a cool little silly little thing, but I thought it was great. I thought it was fun. Um, I loved that about this like a little weird like thing that was probably like I wonder how they did that. Was it like a simple like string thing that the like they had it to where it was like a Spider-Man thing where it's like a magic trick where like a person had like string at their finger and every single time it looked like it looked like they just kind of like were like shooting this stuff out of their hands, but it was actually just like string at the end of their fingers where like hey when you like when you're going like the like make a fist every time and there's gonna be string on here and then just and like that's how you're gonna get the remote every single time out of your hand. You would like I would be kind of interested to see if anybody was like playing around with that the whole time like during takes or just like like Spider-Man like the whole entire time just to have fun with it. um but I thought that thing was so simple, but I thought it was like always so cool how these people were just like sliding the remote out of their hands and back into their hands and stuff. I thought it was funny. So anyways, that's all I'm going to say about Stay Tuned. I think reasonably there are some times where like I'll spend like an hour and a half or an hour talking about something, but I think this one was luckily much more simple to do because reasonably it's a older movie, and then too like there's a lot of small variety pieces, and like at the end of the day, like John Ritter's big or Roy's big thing that eventually he stopped watching TV. He only watches like 60 minutes, and basically he is fencing with kids, and ultimately you have the kids like that is like fencing along with Roy, and Roy's like, "Hey, where did you learn that?" And the kid's like, "Yeah, I learned it while watching TV." And he's like, "Well, watching too much TV is gonna get you into trouble. Like, believe me, it'll happen." Like, I think it's funny now to look back on this movie and with all kinds of streaming and all kinds of like movies eventually at our fingertips that like TV was like an actual thing that it felt like you needed to watch. Like especially like the news or like nonstop coverage in the news, you need to watch the weather, you need to watch like I think now like I just go like, you know what, like I just want to watch this movie. I want to figure out how to watch it. And so I think that's my simplicity of it all. Like every once in a while I'll watch a weekly television thing or I'll like go into watching an entire series of something. But not saying that I don't watch enough about stuff because like I'm fascinated. Uh I just want to like break things down at some point and just kind of see the parts of it. So that's ultimately what I do at some points. So I'm gonna get out of here talking about this for yeah. So I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Stay tuned for whatever review I do next. Stay tuned for whatever I'm gonna do on this channel because uh, I was amazed that I was able to like get two reviews and they went fairly easy and fairly well. Because ultimately I'm just like, oh my god, I want to do this movie, but I'm not sure if I'm gonna like. I'm not quite sure if like because there's some movies where I'm like, oh man, this movie was too complex or too whatever, and I'm like, but I want to do it. I want to talk about it. So I go into it. And I'm like, yeah, this is gonna take a while. But yeah, I like these simple movies. I like these simple little things. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.